As I was saying, thank you everyone. Everyone's speeches thus far have been very informative. Before I begin, let me ask by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the sanctions on the Republic of Cuba? Right, so not many. Historically, this has been a very contentious issue, but recently it's fallen out of the public eye. In my speech, I will not be going over an analysis of controversy or debating the morality of the subject. I only hope to provide you a historical background on the sanctions regime on Cuba, as well as the modern impact on the economy as well as humanitarian aid. The sanctions regime on Cuba is the longest in history and today has many political and economic consequences on its people. Beginning with a historical background, the sanctions on Cuba began in 1953 after the Cuban Revolution, when the Cuban government nationalized all industry in the country, including companies owned by the United States. In response, then President Dwight D. Eisenhower banned all exports to Cuba, excluding food and medicine. In 1961, after the failed invasion of Cuba by CIA-trained Cuban exiles known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Kennedy administration placed a further comprehensive embargo on Cuba, banning all trade, financial transactions, and travel to the country. In 1982, in response to Cuba providing material support to national liberation struggles in Latin America and Africa, the Reagan administration designated Cuba as what's referred to as a state sponsor of terrorism, which among other things restricts trade benefits, most foreign aid, support from international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, as well as other benefits, and valid licenses are required for virtually all exports to the country. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the largest material supporter of Cuba, George H.W. Bush signed into law the Cuban Democracy Act, which among other things placed a 180-day time limit on any vessel doing trade with Cuba from unloading any cargo to any U.S. port. As well as, and this is a direct quote, vessels carrying goods or passengers to or from Cuba or carrying goods in which Cuba or a Cuban national has any interest is restricted from unloading their cargo in a U.S. port. And it also restricts imports from third countries. In 1996, under the Clinton administration, President Clinton signed into law the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act, also known as the Helms-Burton Act, which importantly penalizes foreign nations from doing trade with Cuba. And it also requires a two-chamber majority in order to repeal it, making it difficult for subsequent presidential administrations to do so. In the Obama administration, many strides were made in terms of normalization, such as lifting restrictions on Cuban Americans traveling to and sending remittances to their families, allowing U.S. financial institutions to open accounts in Cuba, and allowing the export of telecommunication technologies to Cuba, and most importantly, removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. However, under the Trump administration, due in part to debunked claims that Cuba was using radiation-based weaponry to attack United States diplomats in the U.S. Embassy in Havana, most of those normalizations were reversed, and harsher restrictions were placed on trade, travel, and remittances. And importantly, Cuba was placed back onto the state sponsor of terrorism list. And under the Biden administration, little progress has been made in terms of normalization. Most of the Trump-era reversals have been continued. And in fact, more sanctions have been placed on Cuban government and military officials. Now that I've covered the historical background, let me briefly go over the economic consequences on the sanctions today. According to official Cuban estimates, these sanctions over the past 60 years have cost Cuba roughly $144 billion. UN estimates suggest that the cost is closer to $130 billion. Dr. Ricardo Torres Perez, an economic professor at American University and an expert on Latin American economic development, stated in an event hosted by WOLA in 2022 that one of the arguments behind the current policy is that the private sector plays a marginal role in the Cuban economy. However, the sanctions affect the private sector the most due to restrictions on trade, travel, and remittances. Alex Baer and Maria Carla Venancia, also in WOLA, published an article in which they stated that Cuba's presence on the state sponsor of terrorism list limits private individuals from opening bank accounts abroad, using instruments for international collections and payments, accessing financial tech companies and digital banking, and contracting with online servers and services. And these barriers stifle the few avenues Cubans have to expand economic growth and development. Now that I've covered the history and the economic consequences, let's look at how the sanctions have impacted Cuba's response to the pandemic. On the 30th of April 2020, UN experts on human rights stated that since the outbreak, the impact of the comprehensive embargo has imposed additional financial burdens, increased cargo travel time due to the inability to procure medical supplies necessary for the treatment of COVID-19 directly from the United States due to restrictions on exports, constraining the effectiveness of the response. And in an NBC article written by Ed Augustin on August 10, 2021, earlier in the pandemic, two Swiss companies previously selling ventilators to Cuba could no longer do so as it was bought out by an American company. In conclusion, I hope to have provided you all a historical context for how 70 years the United States has had a comprehensive embargo on the Republic of Cuba, and today it still has many political and economic consequences. And I urge you all to do your own research on this subject and to come to your own conclusions. Thank you all for listening.